YWCA, worked for Senator Schumer for almost 4 years, so I can attest to the fact that you don't want to be between him and the television camera. And the Sunday afternoon press conference does work very well. At any rate, we have on our panel today Dennis Ward, who I've known around town for a long time, and back in the days when I was a treasurer for a campaign in town, would call him for advice on what to do so I wouldn't get in any trouble. He is now the commissioner, the Democratic commissioner for the Board of Elections in Erie County, as well as an attorney. We also have Doug Ferrand, who I've not met until today, and we're pleased to have him here. He is a political consultant who oversaw the retaking of the Democratic majority in the New York State Senate, also was involved in Tom DiNapoli's campaign in 2010, and also oversaw the independent expenditures on now County Executive Mark Poloncarz' campaign. So our goal for today is to kind of do an overview on some of the basic elements of operating a campaign. We won't be able to be all-inclusive, but there will be web links and obviously Board of Election links and other places that we'll provide that you'll be able to go to for additional information. So right off the bat, I think we're just going to ask Doug to give kind of an overview of a campaign.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, with a half hour for Dennis and I to tell you all of the operational elements of a campaign, I'm going to have to speak very quickly. But I want to go through this and then give some time for questions. And we're just going to go through sort of the major factors. When you're setting up your campaign operations, and campaigns are won and lost on operational capacity. You know, I mean, obviously you need your media, whether it's TV, mail, or whatever, but it's the nuts and bolts of running the campaign every day from now, if you're running now, until election day, that is going to be the make or break element of whether or not you are ultimately successful. And there are 4 elements to this. First, you got to get on the ballot. If you're not on the ballot, you're not running. It's as simple as that. Second, you need to raise money. You need to communicate your message to the voters. And finally, you need to turn your voters out. Those are the 4 core elements of campaign operations. Getting on the ballot and petitioning, I'm going to turn over to Dennis in a sec. But first, I want to talk about sort of planning for these different things. You know, when you're doing a campaign, you need to know exactly how many votes you need to win, and you need to build a campaign plan that gets you to that win number. The win number it's a very simple calculus. You look at the history of the district that you're running in, you find the most relevant, comparable elections, you figure out how many people voted in those, and you divide it by 2. Then you add 1. That's your win number. If you set up your campaign plan that does not reach enough voters and does not turn enough voters out to get you to that win number, you don't actually have a campaign plan. You just have a bunch of words on paper. You need to get to that goal that's going to put you over the top. If it's a multi-candidate race, obviously it becomes a little more fuzzy, and you know we do get out the vote and we try and mitigate fall off from top of the ticket to try and influence that, because it's not a hard and fast science. But the reality is, you need to do that, and again, figure out every voter in your district, who you're going to target, and how you're going to reach them over the course of the campaign. In your planning, you need to first start with a budget, and you need to be very, very aggressive about assessing the value of every dollar you spend and how it gets you towards your ultimate win number. You know, people love t-shirts. That's fantastic. They don't really do much for you. Lawn signs are the bane of political consultants' existence. I know people love lawn signs, blah, blah, blah. You actually do kind of need them because they send a signal that your campaign is real to like committee members and insiders. They don't actually vote, and you want to minimize your expenditures on those types of items. Pens, nail files, balloons, throw them out. Keep them out of your budget. Every dollar you spend on those is money coming out of voter contact. Yeah, and finally, like in planning these kinds of things, make sure that you're focusing on communications that reaches the voters that you need to reach. You don't need to reach every voter in your district. You need to reach the ones who are going to vote and who might vote for you if they do. If your billboards go out there to everybody, well, you know what? If 100,000 people are driving by your billboard every day, but only 400 of them can actually vote for you, you've wasted a lot of money, because advertising is based on the number of impressions that you make, the number of people who see it. TV, if you're buying broadcast TV in Erie County, you're trying to reach over 1 million people. Again, like if you're in a county legislative race or even a county-wide primary, frankly, TV may not be your best medium because you're paying to reach those million people, even though, frankly, in a countywide primary, you only may need 40, 50,000 of them to vote for you. So you're basically multiplying your expenditures by 20 with no added benefit, and TV is really expensive. A lesson that I try to tell to candidates in building their campaign plan, look, you're all good looking and talented and very smart. I try to tell people, don't think you're special as it relates to other candidates. Don't think you're going to be the person who all of a sudden everybody's going to turn out to vote for, even though they've never turned out to vote before. Don't think you're going to say, look, I have this idea that's great, and all of a sudden the world's going to open up for you. It just doesn't work that way. You really need to be nuts and bolts on the ground, reaching voters every single day, and convincing them every day to come after you. And finally, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later on, you just need to target and target and target and figure out exactly where each and every individual vote is going to come from. But that's sort of your broad-based planning. I want to turn it over to Dennis to talk a little bit about how you get your name on that ballot, because without that, all the planning in the world doesn't do you any good.
Right, exactly. And Dennis is going to talk a bit about petitioning, and that's the annoying process when people walk through your neighborhood with those clipboards and bang on your door and ask for your signature, and there's all kinds of pitfalls around that. And I have a good friend of mine who had lots of money behind her to run for a school board seat and did not have a sophisticated enough petitioning team. She was even able to get on the ballot, so it didn't matter that she had all the money and the name recognition, and probably would have been a really good school board member. Her petitions were bad, and so she didn't get a chance to even be on the ballot. So take it away, Dennis. How do you get on the ballot?
First of all, Doug, about emery boards. When my mother passed away, I found an emery board from Judge Mann's from 25 years before, and you might have a tinge of gender bias there, but I know one thing, people that get emery boards keep emery boards. So if you're planning on running many, many times over 25 years, you might want to consider emery boards. But other than that, I agree with the rest of it. Ballot access in New York State has been described as the greatest nightmare in the United States. The rules and laws that govern the use of petitions are, of course, legend, usually in the candidates who have failed to make the ballot. And as Lynn said, many a good candidate has stumbled at the outset and not gotten onto the ballot, and we've never ever had the opportunity to learn what a wonderful, great person or representative that person would be. Ballot access is done almost exclusively by petition in New York State. There are a few exceptions when there's special elections and Supreme Court, but other than those, ballot access is done by petitions. There are two types of petitions, two general major types of petitions that you will hear the names. And I want to just explain them because it's always one of those Board of Elections things, you know, you kind of wince when the newspaper repeatedly, sorry Margaret and Jeff, but the newspapers repeatedly misuse the words. There are designating petitions and nominating petitions, okay? Most of you would use a designating petition, and a designating petition simply means that you will be a candidate of an existing political party. New York State currently has 6 existing political parties: Democrat, Republican, Conservative, Working Families, Independents, and Green. An existing political party simply means that that party, under New York law, gained more than 50,000 votes at the last gubernatorial election and are then afforded party status for the next 4 years until the next governor's election, and then if they repeat, they stay on, and if they don't, they fall off. Green Party was on, they fell off, they came back on. The other parties have been there for a little while longer. So if you are planning on being a candidate of one or more of those parties, you will use a designating petition, and that simply gets you a ticket to the party primary. The party primaries are currently held in September. There is some question, that's up in the air now, in the future years. This year it will be held in September. Future years, due to some interaction with a federal law for overseas voting, some of you may know that there's a special court-ordered primary next or a week from Tuesday. The federal candidates all are going to be required to have primaries at least at this time in June. And the question is, in the future, will the state legislature blend or combine both of them and put them at the June primary? But whenever that primary is for state, county, local offices, if you're seeking to be a candidate of a political party, you will be ultimately circulating designating petitions. Okay, so just keep that in mind. The word nominating petitions you should probably take out of your vocabulary unless you plan on running on the Justice for Victims or the Good Neighbors Party, or you're going to create your own political party and get your own independent line on the ballot. Not one of the existing parties, but the line for the Justice for Victims or Good Neighbors of Buffalo, or whatever you might want to call it. That's a nominating petition. It goes directly on the November ballot, has nothing to do with the primaries. Now, designating petitions are relatively simple, and we think anyway. Right now, you should probably know the New York State Board of Elections has a very good website. We like to think that the Erie County Board of Elections has a very good website. You can look at either one of them, and they have sample petitions and innumerable instructions as to how to circulate petitions and some of the requirements and whatever. I'm not going to bore you with the details of all of the pages and pages of requirements, but the fact is that for a designating petition, you will need a certain number of signatures in the jurisdiction that you're running in to qualify for the ballot. It differs. There are certain offices that have specific minimums that are set under the election law, and there's also a link to that on the state board website. If certain things like a county legislature or common council for the city of Buffalo, the 500 vote or the 500 signature margin for the two major political parties, there are certain numbers that are set. The general rule, unless there's certain numbers that are set, is that 5% of the enrolled voters of that political party in the jurisdiction that you're running in is the required number. So it will vary. I'm not going to recite all of the jurisdictions here, but generally speaking, it'll be the lesser of either the 5% or the numbers that are specified in the election law for minimum number of signatures. The number of signatures that have to be obtained means the number of valid signatures. And you'd be surprised. You think, well, gee, how hard can it be? I've gotten petition signatures to oppose the rezoning at the end of my street and all the various things. Those are all the so-called informational petitions, which are simply presented to a governmental body or to some entity to give the opinion of the people in the neighborhood. Nobody's checking the accuracy of who signed and whether they are a resident of that street, really, things like that. But the people who check petitions do check to see that the people who signed a petition are actually members of that political party. So when you are assembling a petition drive, you have to make sure that you have people who've been trained in it, and I think Lynn mentioned that we might have a graduate level course for those who move from some initial interest to, yeah, now I'm really going to jump into it. Again, I won't get into a lot of the intricacies of petitions, but generally speaking, the rule is that if someone is carrying a petition for you for the Republican Party, then they must be an enrolled member of the Republican Party. You can't just say, well, I'm the candidate and I'm running. If you don't happen to be enrolled as a Republican, you can't witness signatures. That's the general rule. There are provisions for notaries and commissioners of deeds, but the general rule is you must be a member of that political party. So when you do get into putting together your campaign volunteers and things, one of the technical sides of it is assembling people who are workers, number one, who are willing to go out and knock on doors, and two, may have to be members of the party that you're petitioning for. If you are a member of the political party that you are petitioning for, you don't need anything other than the petitions and the number of signatures. But one of the real traps in New York State is what's referred to as the minor parties, the other parties, or the parties other than the one in which you are enrolled. Because if you must be a member of the party to be a candidate, it's easy if you're a Republican and you're circulating Republican petitions, But what happens if you say, yeah, but I'd like that conservative party endorsement too. I'd like them. Well, the answer is, generally, the rules are that unless that party authorizes you, allows you to run as a candidate in their primary, the general rule is you don't go anywhere. You can circulate petitions, you can get every conservative in your district to sign, but if the party doesn't grant an authorization, you can't be a member of that party. You can't be a candidate of that party. Now, again, there are provisions for write-ins, and I won't cover that now. We can talk about it later if you have a question, but generally speaking, that is something to recognize, because as you're beginning your planning for your campaign, and there are a variety of things, one of the things you have to decide is, what am I? First, check to make sure that you're in the party that you think you are. Some people remember what they voted for at the last presidential election, and they think, oh, I voted for Obama, I'm a Democrat. And you'd be amazed at how many people think that. And the answer is, you better make sure that you check to see what you marked on your registration form as your political party. And if you have workers, you would have to also do that for each worker that would be going out and carrying your petitions. So that whole process culminates. It's a 5.5-week process. It is, as was mentioned, this is the time of year because, ironically, it just started last week, and it will proceed for 5.5 weeks, culminating in the filing period, the second week in July, at the appropriate Board of Elections. If you run for local offices, it'll be filed with the Erie County Board of Elections. If the district in which you're running crosses county lines, all the petitions and other filings are done at the State Board of Elections. But for all of your local offices, you would be filing in the Erie County Board. The petitions are filed, and then in a very competitive political environment, of which Erie County is a very competitive political environment, might I assure you, those who would seek to keep you off the ballot will take the opportunity to examine your petitions very carefully to make sure that you have followed all the rules, dotted the I's, and crossed the T's. And people who think that, oh, gee, there's an extra signature in there, no one will notice that. There's a whole page of 25 of them. There's one in there that, yeah, well, the guy wasn't home, but I just wrote it in. Be very, very careful. Every signature will be scrutinized, and you can be, one, embarrassed when you find that you relied on signatures that were not valid, and two, worse than embarrassed if you or a close part of your campaign staff actually submitted a signature that really wasn't a signature, if you know what I mean. We refer to it sometimes as table topping, where people decide they need some extra signatures, so they sit around a table, they pass a clipboard around, people just write names in from a street that they look off a sheet, and they've never went out and knocked on those doors, and you'd be surprised how quickly people who are very adept at political petitionings can pick up on so-called forgeries. It's a reality. I would strongly recommend against it because, number one, it's illegal. You can go to jail for it. And number two, it's another quick way to terminate your candidacy, because nothing worse than ending up on the wrong end of a proceeding in state Supreme Court to invalidate your petitions for fraud, where signatures of people that are claimed to have been put on there weren't put on there, and they dutifully bring people in to swear, that's not my signature. Or as we had at the Board of Elections 2 years ago, when we had a hearing on the petitions that were objected to, and the lady came in and said, that's not my signature, I know my signature. And she says, and that's not my son's signature either. And of course the son wasn't there, and she was asked, well, how do you know what your son's signature looks like? She said, because he died a year ago. The person who circulated that petition currently has some issues. We'll just say has issues that, let's put it this way, it was a lawyer. So those are the kinds of things, they pop up, and people who have examined petitions over the years are very adept. I mean, I can look at a petition and I can give you a good, just by looking at it, I don't have to compare the signatures to the poll files. I can tell you if the same handwriting has been done. I'm not qualified as an expert, of course, as a handwriting expert, but after a while, on-the-job training, you know. So that's something you have to be very concerned with. And when you do that, make sure that your employees of your campaign, your volunteers, are very aware of the seriousness of the petition process. You are filing public documents in a public office. That could be a crime. It's, the filing of a false instrument. It says at the bottom, it's the equivalent of an affidavit. If you swear that you saw the people sign and you didn't, you're making a false statement legally, and people have been prosecuted for it. It's not a huge part of the district attorney's workload, but they do prosecute it. So be very, very careful about that, and you have to make it really clear to your volunteers that they can't shortcut things because it can only serve to embarrass the candidate and the campaign. Classic examples, we call them husband and wife signatures. Mr. is home, he signs, well, my wife's not home, but she'd sign for you. Here, I'll sign for her. I sign for everything. And they do. They do all the time. I mean, some people, many spouses will tell you that the bank wouldn't know their own signature because the spouse always signs their checks and deposits them. That happens. The people don't, the voters don't think they're doing anything wrong, but as the witness to that petition, it is wrong, and they have to know that. I have, when I'm called upon to advise campaigns, occasionally, I have a standard rule that says that under no circumstances would I ever have a candidate himself or herself circulate petitions. And the simple fact is this: there's too much of a possibility of embarrassment to the campaign. If the candidate does something wrong, if you go up to a house as a candidate and get the signature of the husband and he says, I'll sign my wife, very often you don't want to insult them. You're there trying to get their signature and their vote. So rather than saying, oh no, that would be illegal, the temptation is, oh, okay, sure, go ahead, Now, if that were to happen, the proper thing to do is you leave and you go through and you cross out that name and just initial it, and that takes it off the petition. But never put yourself in that position, because you know what? You're out all day, all weekend. 5 weeks later, you're signing at the bottom of these petitions. You don't remember which house it was, so you just sign as the witness. And if a candidate does it, the fraud is elevated considerably, and then it is a problem, and that's when your petitions get thrown out. So my suggestion to any campaign is, if you are a candidate, if you feel that you really want to go out and circulate petitions, go ahead, just don't file them. You may feel that it's a good use of a campaign technique where you can go to the door and get somebody's signature because they're doing something and committing to your candidacy. But I would never, if I were a candidate, file a petition that was circulated by that candidate. Make sure you get sufficient numbers without the numbers that the candidate gets, because you're setting yourself up. And you know what also happens? This is a weird world. You just never know. Somebody who signed may be gotten to by somebody later on and says, why did you sign for Dennis Ward? Everybody knows he's a communist. Oh, I didn't sign. And then they're out swearing down the road, I never signed. So that kind of stuff does happen, not a lot, but it does happen. And my recommendation would be stay away from that. Now, do you need a lawyer? No, you don't need a lawyer. You could end up in court, then you will need a lawyer. But the process is petitions are filed at a board of elections. Your opponents have the opportunity to file objections, which means there's a process to go through to object to it, and then the Board of Elections, as an administrative agency, will handle the objections. They will look at all the objections that you say or that someone says onto your petition. We will administratively either rule them in or out, and we will come up with a number of valid signatures. If there are enough valid signatures, you're on. If there's not enough valid signatures, we say you're off. And either way, the state Supreme Court can review what the Board of Elections has done. And all I can say is this, is try and do your petitions well. You don't want to be tied up in a proceeding at the Board of Elections where you say, oh, I can win it, because maybe you can. And you don't want to be tied up in a Supreme Court lawsuit seeking to invalidate your petitions on fraud or whatever, because you think, well, I can win it. Sure you can. But let me tell you, my experience is this. If you have a candidacy where your very existence of your candidacy is tied up at a Board of Elections hearing with a candidate or a court proceeding that is yet to come, there is nothing that saps the energy out of your campaign quicker than for all of your supporters to be wondering, geez, is Ward going to be on the ballot? I mean, why should I go out and campaign in August in the hot weather? He may not even be on the ballot by the time he gets done at the Board of Elections or in court. And furthermore, do you think people are going to contribute to your campaign wondering whether you're even going to be on the ballot? So I think that, you know, keep that operation clean. Make sure if you need help, come to the second graduate level course that we're going to have here. And we'll go through the very intricate details of that. And I think that that's, if you take away nothing else, remember, no shortcuts in petitions. Everybody is watching. Everybody is watching. And especially if you're in a kind of, if you're coming in as an independent, you're going to be going up, bumping up against people who are experienced, whether it's the political parties or the incumbents or whatever. They'll be watching, and you will be in trouble if you take shortcuts.
Right.
Now, can I don't know, earlier I just wanted to put in one pitch on campaign finance. You covered fundraising. I was not here. Did they cover campaign finance reporting?
Yes.
Okay,
we
okay.
did.
Well then,
Okay.
if you have any questions on that, but that's also a very important thing, because another nice way to get followed up on a publicity level if you don't do your filings. So,
Yeah.
okay.
How many folks here have carried petitions? A lot of people?
Ooh, okay,
Yeah.
well,
One of that's of all the campaign activities that are, petition carrying is my favorite one, which is strange, and I'll tell you why. And doing it in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods is my favorite place to do it, especially on the west side of Buffalo, where we have a lot of recent immigrants. Because once the community realizes you are not from immigration services, which they always think you are when you start to walk down the street, the people who are on the front porches quickly go inside. But then there's always a teenager that speaks English and tells mom or dad why you're there, and you're there to help them vote in America. And it is a really satisfying thing then to walk down the street and see everybody come back outside who wants to participate and vote in America. And you know, there's no more on the ground in being involved in campaigns than that. And that's the kind of thing that when I'm in a hot day circulating petitions in a really wealthy neighborhood, when I want to be doing something else, I think about those moments, because those are, for me anyway, that's the kind of thing that fuels me to keep you involved in the process when you can easily become really cynical.
or they express the relief that, oh, I thought you were from NIPER.
So Doug's going to talk to us now a bit about research. What does research mean in the context of a campaign?
Yeah, research actually means a number of different things, and I'm again going to quickly go through the sort of four major elements of it. The first is what's called opposition research, finding out stuff about your opponent. You know, it's an area where you can pay people a lot of money to do it. You can also, frankly, with the internet being what it is, you can do an amazing amount of research online. But generally, when you're running campaigns, especially if you're looking at local offices, you're going to be running on building yourself up, not tearing your opponent down. Unless there's some silver bullet thing out there that's going to take your opponent down, I wouldn't advise using a lot of time or resources trying to find out that, you know, so-and-so had a DWI 20 years ago, or, you know, frankly, was behind on their taxes once. You know, it happens, and it's not going to really help you that much. That being said, the second part is what we call self-research. You may know all this stuff, but you should, you know, if you're going to run for office, I would go out there and the first thing you do is Google your own name and find out what pops up. You should start to think about, frankly, what may be out there that could come back to haunt you. We live in an age where there really are no secrets, as the media panel was saying earlier. You know, so if you have that DWI back there, and people do, people make mistakes. If your house was foreclosed on, which happens, if you file for bankruptcy, if there are tax liens, whatever it is, assume it's going to come out and be ready for it. Know that it's going to come out. You should also, frankly, as an element of self-research, get rid of things that are potentially embarrassing. You know, lots of people, you go to their Facebook page and they've got a picture of themselves after work, you know, at a bar with some friends one night, and it's a fun picture. Woo, we're all drunk. It's a terrible thing to have out there. You know, as a consultant, frankly, we go to our opponents' Facebook pages to find bad pictures of them to put in the attack lit that we send out and fill up your mailboxes with.
That's true. When I was working for the senator, there was the no hat, no singing, no alcohol rule.
Yeah. I mean, and you know, it's a very easy thing to get tripped up on. And the reality is, once something is up on the internet, It's hard to get it down, but you don't want to make it easy for your opponents because they will find it. You know, and again, if it's Facebook, if you've got a Flickr stream, you know, whatever it is, clean it up and take it down. And be aware as you're creating your current Facebook pages, you may think things are funny that you're going to make comments on. It may be wildly inappropriate in the context of a campaign. There are teachers who get fired because they write things like, "Oh, kids were real jerks today." Okay, maybe they were. My dad was a teacher. It can be a rough job sometimes. You just don't put it out there for public consumption. And again, don't make the mistake of thinking because only your quote-unquote friends, your Facebook friends are reading it, that it is somehow private. Facebook friends are not real friends. We all love them, but it's just not. So you've got self-research, and again, you've got to know what's out there and what can come back and haunt you. You've got opposition research, which there may be a role for it in your campaigns. The one thing I tell people about doing opposition research is make sure that what you're researching fits into the context of the campaign that you're building, or fits into the context of where you think your opponents are going to attack you. We were doing some work a couple years ago for Dave Valesky. He's a senator in Syracuse. His opponent was a Tea Party guy who was coming at him hard for being a tool of New York City liberals. Wasn't true, I'll say that, but that was the general line of attack. Well, so we did some digging, and it turns out the guy had been registered as a Democrat in Manhattan just a few years earlier. Not only that, had taken money from the NEA and taken money from the state government for various arts programs, and actually kicked back money from his nonprofit to another elected official, to a campaign committee, which was totally illegal. These are things he shouldn't have done. We knew that was going to be his line of attack on us. We did a little digging. It wasn't hard to find out, and there it was. Then you've got issues research and, frankly, district research. The issues, people try to do sort of a Chinese menu approach to issues all the time. They go through and they say, well, here's my position on 50 different things. And having positions on 50 different things is equivalent to having positions on 0 things. Nobody's going to get through that. You want to pick the 3 or 4 issues that are most germane to the voters in your district, not what's important to you personally, what's important to them because it's about their choice, and you want to focus on those things, and you want to know those issues. If you're knocking on somebody's door and you're saying, you know what the problem is? Property taxes, which is a very legitimate thing to say. You better know about property taxes. You better be able to talk, frankly and honestly and accurately about how people are being taxed, how their money may be being wasted, what some other alternatives are. You can't just say property taxes and walk away because somebody at the door is going to call you on it. And then, once you've lost those votes, you'll never get them back. And finally, the district research is just knowing your district. There's a phrase that we use sometimes, you got to marinate yourself in the numbers of your district. You have to know ED by ED, how EDs perform in a partisan nature. If you're running in a general election, primaries are different, but you've got to know how many votes are in each election district that you're trying to get to, and you've got to prioritize which districts you're going to go to based on where the greatest potential for you is. Some EDs, if you're a Democrat and you're not going to go to a bedrock Republican ED because you're wasting your time. Every step you take, every door you knock on means you're not walking somewhere else, you're not knocking on another door. If you're wasting your time there, you end up basically using up what is one of the most limited resources of the campaign, which is the candidate's time, and you never want to do that. So know your district, know the issues, know yourself, and to the degree that it's necessary and appropriate, know your opponent. But the district part leads me into the targeting section.
Yeah, and in the interest of following the earlier panels of advice and not ignoring calls from the media, I'm going to go return Stan Evans' call from the Buffalo News, and you can talk about voter targeting.
I will talk about voter targeting. When we approach any campaign, the first thing that we do is establish what we call the target universe. This is the group of voters that we're going to message to over the course of the campaign, and we're pretty rigid about once we define it, that's what we stick with. And it is based on a few factors. Number one, who are the people who historically have voted in this type of election? If it's an odd year local election, you don't want to go to presidential year only voters because they probably won't turn out. If it's a primary election, you want to generally go to people who vote in primaries, although it's not a hard and fast rule. But you want to look at people with a history of voting in the type of election that you're running in, plus new voters. And then you build onto that if there's some particular element of your candidacy that is going to draw out more voters. For instance, right now, our firm, we're running a congressional campaign down in New York for a woman named Grace Meng, who is we think she's going to win, and she will be the first Asian American member of Congress from New York. Well, that's going to have a very positive turnout effect within the Asian voting community. So we're going to go deeper than just the prime voters, the primary voting voters in that community, because we know that the aspirational nature of her candidacy really will boost turnout beyond the traditional universe. But beyond that, frankly, if you're reaching out to more people, you are better off spending your money reaching the right voters 10 times than reaching all voters 5 times. Every single election, over and over and over. And again, like I said, you're all good looking and talented. You're not special when it comes to elections. If people haven't voted in elections before and they've been registered for years and they just don't turn out, they're not going to turn out and vote for you. Again, unless there's something different, something that's really going to change the underlying dynamic, but odds are against it. So you build your target universe, and those are the people whose doors you knock on, those are the people who you call on the phone, those are the people that you mail to. And those are the people that you try to reach out to throughout the course of your campaign. And again, your target universe has to be big enough such that when they're turning out, when they're voting for you, it gets you to a win number that actually wins. If it doesn't, then you need to redefine your target universe. Sometimes you do need to go deeper. If you're looking at a November election, when you're a Democrat, you start with Democrats, and then usually you add in independents and Greens and Working Families Party members. Do you add in Republicans? Probably not, unless there's some reason to. In a past election in the North Country, we had a candidate that we knew from our polling actually did really well with Republicans. He generally got good support there. So we went a little bit deeper. We didn't go to the prime voting Republicans because people who vote in primaries tend to be the most ideological members of their parties, Democrat and Republican. We knew it would be harder to get them to cross over. But the non-prime, consistently voting Republicans in one particular county in that district were part of our universe, and we actually ended up winning that election with their support. Our opponents in that election, who were the Republicans, were actually turning out Republican votes that were voting for us, which we found ironic, and it definitely helped us at the end of the day. But it does get down to, you got to know your target universe, you got to know where your support level is, and frankly, make sure that as you're turning people out, that you're turning out people who are going to vote for you. When we get to the end of the campaign, we've gone through and we've identified our target universe, and we've canvassed them, and we've mailed them, and we've called them. So we have our list of ID'd supporters, and we go to turn those folks out. And then beyond the people who said, yes, I'm voting for you, we also look at what we call the blind pull universe, which are people that we can presumptively assume will, for the most part, support our candidate. It's a dangerous game. If the data that's coming back on doors, or if the data that you're getting out of polling, or wherever you're getting it from, says you're running 50-50 with a particular universe, you don't want to just turn them out generically because they're probably not voting for you. And you're actually going to be helping your opponent, which is what our opponents, the GOP, were doing in that state Senate race. So, summarizing that, and again, I know I'm going fairly quickly, but you've got to figure out what the right target universe for your district is, and religiously just hit that universe and stick to it. Don't go beyond it. It is always tempting to think, oh, well, if I just talk to enough people in the opposite party, I can convince them. No, you can't. I mean, it's not going to happen, and you're always better off going to the people who are already somewhat predisposed towards supporting you and winning their support, and then making sure that they do turn out and vote on election day. We have pretty bad voter turnout in this country, which means that the votes are out there, frankly, for anybody to win if they can effectively mobilize them. So with that, I know the next thing on the list is canvassing. Dennis, did you want to jump into canvassing?
Yeah, I'll do. I think canvassing is an area where, in many ways, you will have to make a lot of different decisions depending upon the type of district you have, the type of neighborhood, the number of volunteers that you have. Those are all things very important. Are you running in a primary in September or June, or a general election? One of the things when you do your jumping back to kind of pre-planning is this: you have to know your district. And when you're selecting the district that you're running in, is it a district that is dominated by one of the major parties in the general election, but if the real competitive race is at the primary? For example, if you're running in the city of Buffalo, it's been a long time since a member of the Buffalo City Council was elected on the Republican line in November. So consequently, The name of the game is the Democratic primary. And all of your efforts at that point would be thrown into running a primary campaign. Some of the data that Doug referred to is actually readily available. The Board of Elections has it. It's public record. It's a minimal cost we have a minimal charge of $20 for anything, but after that, it's not much more expensive for any particular district. You get all of the voters that you need. If it's a primary, you may only want, let's say, the Democratic voters. You can get the voter history. Most voters don't know this. We don't know how you voted, but we know if you voted. And that's something that's kind of important as a candidate to know that that's out there, because you can be sure your opponents will know it. In determining if you're going to be canvassing, another one of those old sayings. We're so old, we have all these old sayings. Fish where the fish are. Okay? If you send your volunteers, if they're canvassing, if you just send them to knock on every door in this neighborhood because it's in your district, you are knocking on doors that, number one, aren't registered voters. Number two, aren't enrolled in the political party that you have a primary in and for which you're running in the primary election in September or June. And three, they may be Democrats, but they may not vote in primaries. So by looking at the voter history, and Erie County has voter history back 13 years for voters, you can purchase, with the voter data that you're purchasing, you can purchase the voter history, knowing what elections each one of these individuals have voted in over the last 13 years. So when you're setting up a canvassing operation, particularly if it's the candidate herself or himself, that's the most precious time that you have. And one of the things, I'm sure Doug would agree, one of the things is this: whatever you do with a candidate who's canvassing, going door to door as we say, one of the things you want to make sure of is that every house that candidate is going to be voting in the election that you're contesting. You don't want the candidate going out and saying, I think I can get these people to come out to vote if I just go and talk to them. First of all, probably not. You're not the best and the brightest and the most beautiful and all that kind of stuff. Very rarely. You might if it's your next door neighbor or if it's your old gym teacher from high school, but by and large, if the voters don't exhibit a predisposition to vote in the elections that you are running in this case, let's say a primary, don't bother. You're not that good. You're not that beautiful. You're not that smart. They will go out, if they feel motivated to vote in a primary, go to the ones who vote in primaries. And immediately you've cut your universe. Oftentimes the core voters in a political primary may only be 10, 15% of the voters in that party in your political jurisdiction. Well, if you're in one political party and then you only have to talk about 15% of the people in that as the general target audience, now the concept of the candidate or certainly the canvassers, the volunteers knocking on those doors, the idea that you can reach every one of the likely voters in that district has just gone up tremendously. There may be reasons why you may want to expand beyond that, and again, everybody, you adjust for your own candidacy. Hypothetically, if you were involved in a very high-profile, very energizing community issue, a rezoning, whatever type of thing might have motivated a huge number of people in a given geographic area where you participated and you believe that you could identify with these people, and you go up and you say, hey, hi Jack, you remember me from the rezoning hearings or the protests or whatever it is, you might be able to motivate certain people in a very highly charged situation. But if you were paying me the big bucks that Doug makes, if you were paying me, I would say go where the fish are that are voting in the last so many primaries. And then you just make an analysis of what type of primaries or what type of general, if it's a general election, what are the races in the last 5 years, 10 years, whatever that you choose, that most resemble the race that you are running in. I mean, the toughest one, to be honest with you, would be running in a year like this. Because if you're running in a presidential year, there are so many people coming out, but they're not coming out for you, believe it or not. I mean, everybody thinks they are, but they're not. They're coming out to vote for the President of the United States. And this is the toughest year in many ways to run because your universe of who the voters are going to come out is so high that you're pretty much getting just almost all the voters. But when you get into the local elections and you're trying to figure out, well, where am I going to send my canvassers? What am I going to do, or my candidate? You want to narrow it down to the narrowest of the narrow universes so that only those people will take up your time. And as Doug said, you might be better off focusing and concentrating on that core group of that universe of likely voters in that primary or general election 2 or 3 times with 2 or 3 different types of hits, as they say. You know, everybody has a different strategy on canvassing, how you go about it. You know, certainly the candidate is different from the volunteers. There's nothing like the candidate or the candidate's immediate family. The spouse of the candidate and the candidate are usually the best. But other people, you know, as long as people go out, I mean, you know, your canvassers that you're sending to the door are the representatives of the campaign. They are not there to make a statement. Remember that. If they feel that the type of clothing they choose to wear is making a statement to the world, maybe they ought to make a statement to the world somewhere else, but not on your campaign, if you know what I mean. If they are really into tattoos, I'm not against tattoos per se, but if they have a tattoo across the forehead that is somewhat offensive and they're just, maybe they're not the best person. Put them on the phones, okay? Clothing, these are all important things. You know, you may think that the rather unique clothing that the kids that showed up at the headquarters are wearing that the clothing they're wearing is really kind of cool, and it's really says something about whatever. Okay, well, just remember that, and I think that Doug will agree. When you find who the prime voters are, it's that horribly old group over 45 or 50. Generally are the ones that are voting, particularly in the local elections. They may not always think that the clothing, the body piercings, the tattoos, they may not think that those are all really as cool as everybody else that's hanging around at the headquarters think. So you're here to win an election, you're not here to make a statement. And sometimes people get into trouble, things get out, someone says, oh, someone did this, or someone said this about a campaign. You're a campaign worker, you're here to win an election, and your canvassers are your representatives to the voters. Don't push something in their face that is something that they're just gonna say, I don't know about that, you know, guy, if he's got a body piercing, or someone's got piercing through their nose and their eyes and things like that, maybe the greatest fashion statement that's around. But a lot of older people just haven't bought into that yet, okay? It's coming, but until that time, you might want to consider that. Clothing is always important. You know, obviously, if you're going out on a day like today, you don't expect people to go out in a 3-piece dark suit with a tie on and a vest. But on the other, tube tops, on the other hand, aren't always appropriate when you're going to, and there may be a certain demographic that likes it, but generally speaking, you don't taunt the voters, because trust me, they'll remember, and you know, keep it conservative. You want them to remember the name of the candidate. You want them to remember that the person at the door was pleasant. Don't have them going out. Don't have them if they're not washed, if their hair's messy, dirty. Obviously, alcohol's a no-no. I mean, I know this stuff sounds funny, but you'd be surprised. You know, people, oh, well, we're having a party for the candidate tonight. You know, we're all going over, and then afterwards we're going to go out canvassing. Maybe not. Maybe not. You know, nothing worse. I think Stefan mentioned earlier about candidate and alcohol. I emphasize that for all candidates. When you're a campaign worker or you're a candidate and you're out in the community, you're on the job. This is your job now. You're on the job. No alcohol, ever. No drugs, obviously, but no alcohol, because alcohol smells. People can smell it. And if somebody comes to your door, just because they came from your fundraiser doesn't mean that they can't smell alcohol. and that's a no-no. So keep your campaign staff focused. Sometimes you get into areas that are a little larger than the city neighborhoods, and you have to have drivers. I'm a big believer when you have a canvass that's being done, certainly by the candidate, a driver is very, very important. Now, why is a driver important? Do I think that the candidate should be sitting in the back like a limousine? No, no. It's not a status thing. What a driver does for the candidate is a few things. Number one, it keeps the candidate working, because you have a tendency to say, well, you know, it's 4 o'clock, it's hot, I think I'll knock off. No, you want your driver to say, no, we're staying out until 7. And so the campaign driver is the conscience. And that, of course, goes with other canvassers. If you have canvassers working together, you send one canvasser out, he goes out for a couple hours, then he goes home. Nobody knows, right? You send 2 canvassers out, they each know what the other one's doing, and they stay out longer. But your drivers in the canvass by the candidate himself or herself also can set up the next contact, so that if you are going from house to house, particularly for a primary where you're clearly not going to be stopping at every house, the driver is the one who makes sure that from the enrollment sheets that you've set up ahead of time knows the number of the street that we're going to next. So as soon as the candidate's in the door, we're off and we're going to 124, and then we're going to 149, and then we're going to 254. And that keeps the candidate rolling so that the candidate's time is not wasted fumbling over sheets and things like that. So there is a benefit to that. Don't think of it as a waste of, well, gee, that driver for the candidate could have been out canvassing. I personally think it's the time very well spent in keeping the candidate on track. So how you set that up, there's a million ways. I mean, we'll talk on that in the graduate course, how you come up with a strategy of who to go to. You know, it all depends on the race and the year and the primary versus the general and all kinds of things like that. But what's most important, I think we come back around to the beginning, what Doug said, and that is this: you have to have a plan. You have to be planning these things. Don't just go out and say, oh, I'm going to be a candidate, and you know, if I build it, they will come. No, they won't. No, they won't. And not only that, if they come, they're going to be unprepared, clothed wrong, and they're not going to be good campaign workers. So spend time organizing your thoughts and having a campaign manager. Now, we didn't mention that, okay? But let me just put in a commercial announcement for a campaign manager, okay? Who's the worst campaign manager in the world? The candidate, right? Never. If you're the campaign manager, you just lost, okay? Because the candidate should be listening and following orders and going out campaigning, not giving orders. I mean, the lower down you go, I mean, I realize that's honored in the breach sometimes, but the fact of the matter is you should have a campaign manager who can direct all of these operations. And the important thing about a campaign manager is this: the campaign manager must be someone who the candidate will listen to, okay? So, depending on the state of your marriage, it may not always be the best to have the spouse, because they may not listen to them. Have somebody who the candidate respects enough to know that if the person has been selected as the campaign manager, they're going to listen to what the campaign manager says. Because candidates are notorious for going off on their own and not following directions, and those are mostly the candidates that lose.
Yeah, right? Yeah, I would agree with that.
Donna, I think we're ready for questions if you want to man the mic. Remember to turn it on at the bottom.
Question for Dennis. On the petitioning, 2 types of mistakes. One is that you don't know if it's the right party, the signer, but this is signed. And the other one is a duplicate.
Duplicate? Yeah, duplicate, yes.
How are those handled?
Well, those are actually probably the 2 most common mistakes that are made by petitions. Number one, as we indicated, if you're carrying a designated petition for the Republican Party, it doesn't do you any good to get to a person who's unaffiliated who says, yeah, but I'm voting Republican this year. Okay, great for you, but you can't sign the petition. So the lack of the proper affiliation is probably one of the number 1 reasons that a signature would be invalidated. Number two, a good point, and that is this: a signer may only sign one petition, okay, for the same office. And so if someone says, "Oh, I didn't know you were running," well, I signed for Bill, but don't worry, if you're running, I'll support you and I'll sign here. Well, first in time, first in right. So the second signature is no good. And if they've already signed, thank them. But I wouldn't bother getting their signature because it'll be invalidated anyway. And what you don't want to do is put a lot of signatures that are invalid, even though you're not going to jail for it or anything like that. But you don't want it, because if you do that, then at the end you'll think, gee, I got about 700 here, I only need 500, I'm okay. And then if you've already included in there 100 or so that you already know are invalid, you're much closer to the threshold of going off the ballot than you think. So those are the two of the most common. Well, that's a probably yes, maybe talk to your lawyer.
But the one thing that I would add on that is, look, the best way to collect petition signatures is to go door to door with a list of party enrollees in that district.
Right.
You know, going to public events, farmers markets, street fair, whatever, you don't know who's signing your petition, and you have no idea whether Democrat, Republican, whatever. You go door to door, you know that you're going to register Democrats, and you're going to get the numbers that you need.
Doug, I've worked on a couple of local campaigns.
Yeah.
One thing that we've had trouble as a group is I think it's ABC voters. The A's vote always, the B's go once, and the C's never. I think that's the term.
Ratings.
Ratings. I mean, is there a rule of thumb, like you chase the A's 100%, the B's I mean, the C's you don't bother with, of course.
Right.
The
Well,
B's, is there a rule of thumb on that?
there are guidelines more than rules, shall we say.
Who is
Look,
thumb
I mean,
anyway? Who is thumb?
Who is thumb?
Yeah.
Well, here's sort of my approach when I'm looking at a voter universe, a target universe, is first you take the people that you know are going to vote and know are going to support you, and you pretty much carve them out because you got them. Then you take the people who might vote, and if they do vote, will probably support you, and you definitely want a message to them. And those are people who have some degree of voting history in similar elections, but not 100% reliable voting, right? I vote in every election, every single election. So, you know, if you go and you pull the voter file, you get it from the Board of Elections, and you see somebody who votes in every single election, they're going to vote. It's a guarantee. If you see somebody who only votes in presidential year elections, and you're running in an off-year election, they're not going to vote. But let's say you see somebody who voted in the presidential election, votes in the gubernatorial election, and occasionally votes in a local election. Well, you know what? That's a maybe voter, and if you message to them, you may turn them out. You know, voter targeting, the negative side of it is it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right? If we never talk to voters, they're not going to vote. Look, I mean, there's no absolute rule. But you want to look at, as Dennis was saying, the people who vote in those elections most similar to yours. If they vote in local elections and you're running for local office, you want to talk to them. If you're running in a gubernatorial year and you have a gubernatorial year voter, you want to talk to them. But if you're running in a primary, you don't want to talk to somebody who's only a general election even year voter, because you're not going to. They're just not going to turn out for you. So use the context of your own race to determine who your target universe is.
Everybody uses different rating systems. You say A, B, C, D. We have a numerical system. Sometimes it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's commonly what we talk about is prime voters. That's the term. And of course, at the Board of Elections, we're always amused because very often we'll have people call and say, "I'd like to order a disc of all the prime voters." Okay, prime for what? What year are you running in? Are you running in a primary? Are you running in a general? You want all voters and whatever. And so what you have to do, as Doug said, is you decide the parameters of what prime means to you. You may, for example, say, well, I want to look at their voting history for the last 5 local elections, odd years, primaries. If you were running for the council president or council member in the city of Buffalo, you might have to look back 3 council races, their 4-year terms. You might have to look back 10 years perhaps, and then say, how did the voters, give them a rating of 0, 1, 2, 3. Did they turn out in the primary for your political party for the local elections? So everybody uses a different one, but just be careful. It's more important for you to define what your prime voter is, and then it can be developed accordingly.
Right. We have one more question.
Generally speaking, the voter turnout is poor in this country. Even during the presidential years, you still get somewhere, what, 60-some%, if you're lucky.
Right.
I'm past president of the League of Women Voters, and I'm on the board of the American Association of University Women. Both these groups are get out the vote people. Right now, AAUW has a campaign nationally to get the millennials out, because the millennials, people 18 to 31 roughly, have the poorest voting record. Now, when Doug was talking about using your money in the campaign wisely, if you were really targeting millennials, you would use happy hours, you would use blogging, you would use different things than you would use for the population that really gets out there to vote. I guess I'm asking, is it worthwhile the effort that the League of Women Voters and AAUW are putting forth to get those people out when, you know, you get them registered and then they don't vote?
Well, I mean, here's what I'll say. Like, look, any effort to turn out more voters, increase voter participation, can be worthwhile. To me, the question is, how do you make that effort most effective for the audience that you're trying to target? You know, if you're looking at the millennials, yes, happy hours, although, you know, I don't know if getting people drunk to get them to vote is going to work. That's true. But yeah, obviously, you know, new media, social media is much more important to younger voters. You know, frankly, you can't reach younger voters by phone anymore because people don't get home phones generally when they're graduating college these days. I wouldn't have one, but my wife insists. But, you know, and I'm a long way from college, obviously. So, you know, but I do think, you know, registering people to vote, if you're trying to increase voter participation, is not enough. You know, people who have not registered actively on their own, when you register them, you then need to follow up with them, you need to communicate with them. And this is actually, there's a lesson in here for campaigns. If you're a campaign that thinks, I'm gonna register new voters and turn them out, you can't just register them and then wait until the election and assume they're gonna show up, because they won't. You need to register them, you need to re-communicate with them, you need to re-communicate with them again and again, and that's how you actually increase voter participation. But it's hard. I mean, and campaigns, you know, we naturally gravitate towards where we get the biggest bang for our buck, right? If I know that, you know, 80% of the voter turnout is going to be above the age of 45, I'm going to focus 80% of my resources on people above the age of 45. That's because I got to win. That's what I do. And so you know, I mean, we're never going to steer our resources into efforts that have a low impact, into efforts where it just doesn't turn that much out. Because, you know, unless you're Mike Bloomberg, you just don't have that kind of money. Money is always a very limiting reagent in every campaign, and so you naturally gravitate towards where the highest propensity voters are, and then build out from there.
I think you're also touching on different functions. In other words, the function of trying to increase registration and then increase voter turnout is kind of a general societal function. We can all, as members of society here, say that would be a preferred goal. And without regard to who the voters are or which party they're voting for, if we just generally had a greater sense of responsibility and turnout, it might actually, there might be a greater sense of faith in the government, perhaps. But that's a different function than the campaign. I don't know if it's fair to try and impose the cost and the effort of that on individual campaigns. A little bit of it is imposed on the party organizations. The parties themselves do sometimes participate in limited registration drives, and in order to get the vote out, you got to get it registered first, so it's a two-part process. But I think that the function of the campaign, it may seem the same, but in a lot of ways it's different. Again, we fish where the fish are. We're not trying to go out and restock the reservoir with the fish. We just, whoever the fish are there, we're going for them. So I think it's a different function. Is it worthwhile? Absolutely. I don't think it would ever be, you couldn't say just because Doug would recommend against it for one of his clients, you can't say that it's not a laudatory function. It's simply two different groups, two different functions, and both of which are part of the system.